This is News Central, and I'm Tolulope Adileru Balogun. As startup and innovation culture has deepened across the continent, last year African startups broke records. Startups operating on the continent received a total of $1.3 billion in startup funding, and this is according to the annual funding report by WeTracker. Now joining me to discuss some issues around startups, I have Gulbet Kiros. He's the co-founder and CEO of Fire Media Incorporated, which is a cloud-based software company. He's also the founder and managing partner of Ferox Partners, an advisory and investment holding company which focuses on building, operating, and investing in the financial services and TMT, that is technology, media, and telecoms sector within Africa and the Middle East. Gulbet, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we hear people say startup, but for a technical definition that we'll use in this conversation, by your definition, what is a startup?
A startup essentially is a company that is essentially forming from the idea phase, moving on to acquiring customers. Once you get through the rapid growth phase, where the product market fit is established and you're a bit more mature, you're kind of considered an SME at that point. So a startup essentially is any venture or entity that is, trying to get off the ground, holistically speaking.
How long can you stay a startup? Because sometimes you hear about companies who have been in business for 5-6 years and they're still referring to themselves as startups.
For me, it's not defined by time as much as it is by your growth. So a startup usually, you kind of go through certain phases. So your early phase is more spent on R&D, kind of establishing, testing your product. That can, obviously take some time till you get into your, what I would consider your first phase being you introduce your product. And if your product takes off, that could take some time depending if you're a direct to consumer, a B2B platform. So you have different trajectories. And honestly, the way I also look at it is startup is a spirit of it's a culture that's ingrained. If you look at a company like Google, for example, they're constantly innovating, right? Launching new products, how they operate until, as big as they are, they've kind of kept that culture of constantly coming up with new, finding an efficient way of doing things. But technically speaking, startup, as most of us know it, is basically a company that's launching and trying to provide service. If you're still a startup 6 years and you don't have any growth, at that point I think you're more of a micro enterprise, or maybe it's just not a viable business. I think there are a lot of businesses that are profitable without scale. So let's say you have a niche customer, you sell your product at X, your cost is Y, X minus Y is positive. It could stay like that for a while, where it's giving you $10,000, $20,000 a month, for the foreseeable future. That's still a good business, right? It still makes money, but it might not just be scalable, right? You've probably built a solution that's that addresses or services a very specific or niche.
How do you think startups can get around the financing issue, especially as it might be restricting their ability to either test their product, introduce themselves in the market, and even eventually, as we talk about, scaling up as it may be?
I think there's a fundamental disconnect between the people that are looking for funding and maybe investors. I think when you kind of limit the conversation to, oh, I have an idea, I can't get funding, you're kind of eliminating a lot of the other consideration that goes into funding. The first thing I want to stress to any entrepreneur aspiring, or even any venture that's looking for capital, is money likes making money in general, right? The issue is, how are you communicating it? There's a relationship aspect to it, especially in our side of the market where you don't have a lot of data to do due diligence on the person. You really have to come out early and communicate not just your idea, the value proposition, of the venture you're trying to launch. You really have to sell yourself. You really have to convince the person to part with their money, and that you are the best steward to execute on this idea, and you'll generate value.
So let's also look at generating some of this interest and appeal organically. There are many stories about how certain investors or founders of tech companies and startups started with just no degree and $5 and the shirt off their back, and then the other truth comes out, and there's a family history and some family money there and some initial seed money and some family friends were also involved. But for those who are looking to go about it the organic way, is it quite possible to generate that funding, that pre-seed or that seeding money organically? Be honest.
I don't like that word organic, mostly because nothing happens in this world that you don't will into, you have to will it or put the effort into making it work. So even if you're talking about that guy who has a great idea with $5, which fundamentally will never happen, just, the cost of setting up an email account, I think with Gmail now is $6 a month. So I think the whole idea of the organic side of it, the best way I would put it is if you define organic as your product is so good, right? Like Uber, for example, I don't think advertised early on. Just it was through word of mouth, and just the utility of the product or service they had was as such that just kind of picked up steam. But whenever you grow, like when you talk about organic growth, it still requires cash. One of the biggest things, I spend time with, instead of just investing with, the founders, and something I also look forward from, the investors, I want to work with, is to kind of absorb as much knowledge as possible. So if you do phenomenally well with your product or service, and you don't have the cash to actually execute it, and I say that because, let's say, you start selling, I don't know, bracelets. Let's say your inventory is getting depleted so quickly, you still need to buy the inventory, right? But you need access to capital. And which kind of goes back to what I said earlier, to, come to market very early on, find build your stakeholders, identify who they are, and communicate what you're trying to do. In the event of rapid growth, and it's managed well, right? Because hyper growth, comes with its own dilemma as well. And you've anticipated, you've planned, and this is where it goes to the people side, right? Like they know how to manage growth by itself. Then the money will come.
How would a startup decide if it is time and place for us to look at the IPO, to look at initial public offering, or continue seeking maybe private investments? What are some of the things that you think should come into the decision-making process in that instance?
So I would say one leads to the other, right? So the early private capital will get you to potentially going public. And the benefit to going public is basically you're attracting a wider pool of capital, but with going public too, there's a lot of scrutiny and regulatory hurdles you need to meet. And there's a lot of expenses also on the administrative side, because you have to constantly file and keep the regulators abreast. I think for our market, obviously we need a lot of intermediaries. In all honesty, if you were to ask me, the biggest disconnect we have is I've seen pool of capital, but they don't know how to deploy it. Then you have a lot of projects, but they don't know how to get in touch with those people, right? So usually, I come from the finance world, and usually you'll have investment. So basically, during an IPO, an investment house or investment bankers will go do the underwriting for you, go market it, and they're the ones who actually help you raise funds, right? So we need a similar type of ecosystem. Instead of just investing in, founders, they should actually also kind of look at it at building, fund managers. A lot of the startups around us, especially those who, have gone through the process. For example, let's say if Shola, founder of Paystack, went to launch a fund, right? He already has the network with founders. He knows a lot of the investment side. He'd be a great intermediary, or people who understand finance, right? They'll be able to guide the young entrepreneurs how to package the company as well. Okay. So I think if we had that, and it will kind of help, to a certain extent, solve some of that problem.
For entrepreneurs looking to find themselves inside the pre-seeding, the seeding, the angel investor, all the way to being Series A and everything, what would your simple advice for them be? You spoke earlier about if you find the customer, eventually the investor will come as well. When you're able to have a product that customers can believe in and can value and bring to the market. So aside from that, what other advice do you have for startups, for entrepreneurs who are especially in the tech, financing, industry and sector as it may be?
Prepare for success. You'll be surprised. I've found great guys, great products. Then when you ask for documentation, there is none.
Crickets.
And like angel investors, and there are plenty that will work with you, but that also kind of weakens your bargaining position, right? That kind of tells me, okay, you're not maybe that good with attention to detail. Do the basics. I think when you focus on, say, maybe just the product, you might forget the product is not the business, right? Technology is not a business. Technology is a tool, right? You have to use that tool to actually create a business, right? When you're talking about a business, it's not just, again, product. You have people, you have your finances, you have your marketing. So to start looking at it holistically, and that will be a game changer. If you prepare for success, almost visualize it like you've arrived, it tends to attract the right types of people around you.
All right, thank you so much. We've been talking to the co-founder and CEO of Fire Media Incorporated, and of course that's Gulbet Kiros, and talking about the startup ecosystem as it may be here in Nigeria as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
This has been a production with News Central. I am Tolulokwe Adileru Balogun.